Yeah, my name's Adrian Carriger, and I'm a software architect at Prismatic. Work a lot with React and TypeScript, and so just want to chat about that today and talk about how that might be a good fit for you and your next project. All right, I'm going to just cover some basics to get us started. So first off, I'm going to kind of get into like what is React, what is TypeScript, and just cover a few basics in case you're not as familiar with that, and just kind of go example by example. So this intro will be pretty short. Let's take a look at. So here's a React component, and on the right, I have it rendering. And so I'm using Create React App. It just kind of renders everything as I type. You know, it's just one of those nice automatic updating things. And an interesting thing about React is that it's there's a lot of focus on functional components. So you can see here, I just have this whole component is just a function. And then it returns this interesting kind of text. This is JSX. And that's just calling some more functions in React land. But what it lets us do is it has a nice abstraction where we don't have to really worry about updating the DOM directly. React will handle that as needed in the background. And it does it pretty efficiently. So with that in mind, let's just take a look at what the abstraction can really give us here. So if I have some kind of an item, and maybe it's interpolation, and I want to type that out and kind of get React to render that. Let's see here. So this is like one of the very basic fundamental things. And so you can see right on the right, we're getting that rendered out there, which is nice. So it's pretty basic, but that is important. It's not completely easy to do well with just vanilla JS and vanilla HTML. Although, I mean, you probably could get that. But then when you get into something like a state examples, like this is where React really starts to shine. And so we've got our basic DOM representation here as the JSX. We've got our count. It's interpolating like before. But what if I want to do something like have a counter or have some kind of a state managed type thing? So in that case, we might just use what React gives us. They have functions called hooks. And this one's called useState. So it's a pretty basic example if you're familiar with React, just to kind of get everyone on the same page. Cool. So useState takes a default parameter. So I'm just going to give it 0. And then we have our state, and then we have a function that will allow us to set the state as needed. So at this point, I'm kind of back to where I started. And I have the count. It's rendering through, but I haven't called this guy. So I'm going to just go ahead and create a handler. And each time that this is called, it's going to take the existing state and just add 1. So it's really basic. I'll connect that up to the button. And so at this point, I can actually have it manage the state for me. And then as events are propagating through the DOM, like React handles the abstraction of connecting that with this useState function. And so it's really nice. Like everything is just very functional. Like I have a function here. It's really like straightforward from my perspective. There's not a lot to keep in your head, which I really like. I think it's a very nice abstraction. One important thing though is that this is a talk on TypeScript, and I haven't actually needed to use TypeScript, even though technically it's running in the background. And so that's kind of my personal favorite way to use TypeScript, is to have it do everything automatically in the background. And then as we need to, we can add in more specific typing here and there. So like this whole component, you don't see any kind of special TypeScript. I could just copy and paste this into vanilla JS, it'd be fine. That said, I can still introspect things, and TypeScript is working for me. So I can see like, hey, here's a number. It's inferring it from the useState. And like it can infer it if I were to give it a string. It would then say, hey, I can see that's a string. So I can see it all the way down. I can see there's functions like this. Here's a function. It does something, but it returns nothing. Like there's just a lot of nice things that TypeScript is doing. And so I think that's the best, is when it's just kind of working for you in the background. So I'm going to just switch over and cover a few basics of what TypeScript is, and then we'll see how they fit. So what is TypeScript? Well, it's a superset of JavaScript. So it's everything that JavaScript is. You don't get anything taken away, but it adds a language to help you describe some of the stuff that we just often as developers might keep in our head. Like, oh yeah, this function takes a number, or this function takes a string, like just some basics. But over time, as your app might get more complex, it's nice to have that explicitly notated. So I'm just going to take a look at a few of the features here. So, okay, TypeScript, we can describe shapes of objects. So I could say, hey, I have some object with some key and it's equal to a string. And so that can become arbitrarily complex, which is really nice if you have a large code base. You can help catch problems earlier. So if you were to have some function that took a number and you gave it a string, you don't even have to run your code. It's just gonna let you know as you're typing, as you're working, like you're gonna get information right away. And this is really cool. Documentation. It's gonna go ahead and pull in documentation from your code, from your third-party libraries code, and it will like mix that all together and show you what you need depending on what you're working on, depending on the context. And then for me, I came from a primarily just vanilla JS background. So when I got started with TypeScript, like it made me a little nervous, but to know that nothing actually changes at runtime is really nice. Like in the browser, even though before in development time, we had a lot of just TypeScript-y stuff, like at runtime, nothing has changed. It's all vanilla JS. It's in a browser. It's pretty like straightforward in that sense. All right. So I'm going to just switch over to a quick TypeScript example. So, all right, here we have a really basic function. It's just supposed to add 1. And you can see I put a little comment above. You can imagine the add 1 function being in a separate file. Like often that's the case. And then when you're consuming the function, you might not exactly remember, like, do I need to give it an object or like, what do I need to give this? So you can hover over and it'll give you some cool stuff. So like immediately it pulls in that comment and you can see it rendered right here. Even if it's in another file, even if it's in another library, like you get all of that. And then the next thing is you have the types, the strongly typed arguments here. So I can see that it takes anything, it returns anything. It's actually not that helpful right now. So we're going to go ahead and just like work this out. Like I know there's a lot of people who they see this is our first actual TypeScripty thing. And they're like, you know what? Like, I don't want to have to do that. Like I thought this was a superset and I want to just use JavaScript where I feel like it. I should be able to copy and paste JavaScript and it should just work. And like, here's what would happen if you did that with the default settings. So I'm going to get a message. It won't let me, just use any here. And so here's the solution. If that's you, like just go to tsconfig and turn off this. And that's going to let you get exactly what you want. And it takes a second, depending on your setup, but it takes a second for it to update. But then now, instead of it making me explicitly type any, it'll just know like, hey, I didn't give it a type. We're going to treat this as JavaScript. And it's just the good old days. But for this talk, I think we're just going to switch back. Okay, so it'll take a sec sometimes to propagate, but there we go. We're back. Okay, so we're at any. Now, this is like maybe not terribly useful. Like look at the output over here. We're not getting maybe what we would desire. So I'm going to say, you know what? I just want to do numbers. Like, why would I add anything except a number? Great. So at this point, it's scolding me for saying, hey, I'm using a string here and it's supposed to be a number. I could comment that out. If this is all I wanted out of this, now I'm guaranteeing that no one's going to pass a number or try to pass a CSS unit. However, like maybe we want to accept both. And so to do that, you just tell it like, hey, this could take a number, a string. If you try to pass it an object, like that's a no-go. It will at least correct that. Okay, so now the inputs are they're validated and they're fine. That's very nice. What about this? So it has an issue. It says, oh, but I can't do this. Like you could, but like it's trying to be helpful. So we'll just go with that. Let's just say if I get an input, I'm going to numberize that. Oops. Yeah. So like if I have a string, and this would work for the second case, you can see here, like, yeah, that's cool, but it doesn't work for CSS units. And so this is where like, if you did have this function and you did want to get more complex, there's some really cool stuff that TypeScript's going to let you do. We're just going to split on the function, or on the type actually. So I'm going to use this is all runtime right here. So I'm going to say the type of the input. If it's equal to a string, which is kind of the odd case when you're adding, like, I don't know how often you add to a string, like in the traditional sense of it, even though you could in JavaScript and you get this, it's fine. By the way, TypeScript let us do that because it knew we meant to. It's very helpful like that, but you can escape out of that if that bothers you. Great. So at this point, here's what's really cool. As I hover, I get this different information. So I'm hovering here, it could be a string or number. I'm hovering here, it definitely is a string. So TypeScript knew about that. It also takes into account early return. So it knows this is a number. If I were to take out the early return, it's then going to realize like that's a string or a number. And so it knows what's happening there. And at this point, we can just like exactly handle this how you'd expect. Oops. There it is. Good. So we're getting 4s, like that's fine. That's just some basic TypeScript, kind of get us started. Really quick to demonstrate like how to describe an object and to get in a slightly more advanced TypeScript case. Let's say we have this. And so right here, we have a thing called an interface. An interface is a lot like a class. It's the only real, like the important difference that I want to have everyone keep in mind is like, it's not going to, this doesn't happen at runtime. This is all during development time. So I can define what I want something to look like. I can say, hey, this has some key, and it's going to be a string. Now, as soon as I do that, because I've explicitly typed this variable to be basically an instance of this or implement this interface, it's going to let me know like that's not valid. That's fine. So I can just go ahead and satisfy that. And let's say we have another one, some array, and that's just going to be a string array. But let's make it optional in this case. So in that case, since it's optional, like that type is fine. I can even start accessing things. So if I wanted to access some key, I can do that. If I assign it, I can see like that variable or that type is carrying through. And then let's say I want to actually switch over to the array. And like I'm going to access some array, and then I'll push a number to it, but it won't let me. So it's catching all of this. It's really nice. Here's a really kind of interesting thing that almost happened on like without me noticing. You see this little question mark. That is the safe operator to prevent pushing or basically prevent doing anything beyond that. If it's undefined, it'll just return undefined and it won't execute anything to the right of the question. So that's because this is possibly undefined. So if I remove that, you get this. Object is possibly undefined. And then like that would lead to some pretty unfortunate runtime errors. I'm sure we've all seen that. Like it's just horrible. So I take some nice comfort in knowing that like, hey, TypeScript is going to help me out here. I really appreciate that. So, okay, let's see. We have strings here. Let's say that we have this my item interface and we want to reuse it. We want to keep our code dry. We want to make this more reusable. And we have a new use case. We want the exact same interface, but instead of strings, we want numbers. So I could change it to numbers and like have my item numbers, but that's going to get crazy and horrible. So I'm going to just say I have some type. This is called a generic in TypeScript. So I have something, it's some kind of a type. Don't worry about what it is. And it's T. And so whatever that is, it's going to be the same here. And then it's going to be the same here. So it'll be a T and a T array. Over here, when I'm consuming the interface, I just say what I want it to be. You could also say, well, yeah, this is just going to default to a string. So then I can take out the explicit thing here. But then what about the number case? So if I switch over to the number, like it lets me know right away, like, oh yeah, you're doing this wrong. Throw in the number. Also, I can't push a string. So it's also there, gonna help me out. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch over to why would we want to do that? Why would we want React and TypeScript? So React and TypeScript. So like I've heard a lot of really good arguments for TypeScript on the back end. And I mean, you can just imagine you have data, you have types, you have probably a database that has very strict types, and you're going to do transformations. You're going to have an API layer. Like there's just so much going on. It kind of makes sense. Like you don't want to mess that up. So why would we want this on the front end as well? Why would we want it with React? Okay, so in my opinion, this is where TypeScript really shines. This is really nice. It's often a lot of the same arguments you'd hear for backend, but we'll just dive into the specifics of why React, why TypeScript with React. So for consuming third-party libraries, you might, the first time you're installing a library, check out their docs, read through it. But like, as you're iterating, and maybe you're coming back to something you worked on a month ago and you don't quite want to visit their docs or remember their docs, it's fine. And you just need some function argument. Like, this is going to bring all of that, all the third-party stuff into your editor, all of that documentation. It's really nice. With apps these days, like lately, client-side state is like definitely a thing with a lot of apps. And it's bad if you mess that up. So this helps you make sure all of the functions are getting the right stuff and you know, the outputs are correct and everything's connecting up. We'll kind of give a quick example in a minute, but it's really helpful. Working in a shared code base. So like, you have a team member, they update something. Maybe you haven't checked out the latest commit history for some reason. And it's fine, because if they made something else required, like, that's just going to come through. That's just really easy. Onboarding team members, which we're hoping to do soon at Prismatic, this is great. A new person comes on, and yeah, they're going to read through the code, but like, when they're actually starting to work, it just brings all of the relevant information right to them. So it's super, super convenient. I'm just going to go through a few examples of using that together. Cool. All right, so consuming third-party libraries. Here's a really basic setup. Like, we have a component, really it's just rendering the default button for Material UI that I've pulled in. And so this button, as simple as a button seems, like there's a ton of options here. So I might not know what they are. I could hit Control Spacebar and it loads up like all of the information, even from the default HTML5 button. So I could definitely scroll through here. I'm seeing a mix of HTML5 stuff and their specific items. I've read their docs, so I know they have some kind of a variant. That's great, but I don't exactly remember what to put here. So, okay, variant, I could give it like an outlined. So I'll just try that. And then maybe they have like some colors, I think. And yeah, there it is. So I'm going to just try their primary. And I can see it rendering there. And then I'll just switch it over, switch it back to contains. So at this point, I'm seeing their button, but maybe I'm not liking the elevation. I know they have a concept of elevation. I think there's something I can do about elevation to get rid of it. So I just start typing it and I can see, oh yeah, disable elevation. Well, of course, that's what I was going to type. And it puts it in there, flat button, we're fine. So that's pretty useful. Like, it's not making me switch back and forth to the docs, switching context, having to, slow down. So I really like that. Cool. So here we're going to extend part of that library. We're back to the same button. I've done a pretty vanilla wrap of what the button is here. We're consuming it here. You could probably imagine these being different files, even possibly different teams. And that's something that TypeScript, I think, really encourages, really helps with, is just making it work for different teams. So like, one team designs something, builds something, the other team can consume it without having to know about all the internals. They can just use something. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to add some basic emoji support, because why not? So I'm going to say, hey, oh yeah, I forgot to explain. This is the interface. So we've pulled in their interface, essentially their properties for their button. We're going to take that, use the TypeScript extends keyword, and just start throwing in some attributes, or one, really. We're going to throw in the emoji. We're going to make it an optional string. So this is now kind of mixing in. We have all of their stuff, and we're additively adding the emoji, which is optional. And it just takes a string. No big deal. I will then supply it with one of our emoji types here. And it's not too crazy. I'm going to just render it to get it started. Okay, so I should see it. Yeah, so it's not really doing anything useful yet. But I'm going to say, okay, cool. So I've got this emoji, and I'm going to say, hey, if the emoji is defined, let's just use that to pull from the map. And let's see what happens. And I can kind of see it there. Oh, and then it goes away. Like, oh, TypeScript caught up with vanilla. That's fine. And so at this point, what do we do? Like, you have options. So you don't have to go into the depths of TypeScript and like do everything if you don't care. You could just say, hey, this is anything. Just work with me. Like, don't get in my way. And let's see, it should render. Okay, so we've got the button, the emoji, it's fine. But here's the thing. If you're really developing and thinking of another team member or another team, this is where it can really, really help. And okay, so what's the problem with this is TypeScript saying like, this key could be anything. This is a string. It's not always going to be one of the three options that we have. So we just tell TypeScript what's going on. We say, hey, this is actually a key of that type of the emoji map. And at this point, it pulls it all together. And it sometimes takes a second. There it is. Okay, so here it's why you'd want to do that. The other team comes in, they add an emoji, they ask for what I can, what can I do here? Like, oh, cool, I want the balloon. Save, done. They didn't have to like check, go into your file, like read that you only supported certain emojis or whatever. It's fine. Like this is just, it just works for them. So that's extending. So I want to dive into like a slightly more complex case, in case you're curious and you just want to see something a little bit more complex with TypeScript. So we have a select component and I have some just things that I can select. They're all strings. And so this is kind of just, the properties that can be passed into. And this is all pretty vanilla. If you just look at this, like the actual guts of this, there's no like third-party library. It's just select. And so what I can do is give it a string array, values a string, it emits a string, and when consuming it, I think, let's see here. Yeah, so I give it the options. I have the state like we kind of looked at earlier, and it's just doing its thing. What if we wanted one day for our options to be numbers? And I think this is actually kind of a realistic thing. Oops, sorry guys. Okay, so let's say we have the options are numbers, and then let's just give it a default of 1. So like this all looks okay. And if this were vanilla JS, like actually it would just be fine. Properties would just fly through, it would be okay. What we're gonna do though, is we could have typed it as any and just like escaped the TypeScript, but we want this to help us. So we're gonna say, hey, I have this generic and it's some type and it's an array of that type, the value is that type and it will emit that type. We're just gonna carry that through. And then we have this select function. And just remember in React, a component is a function most of the time these days. So we're gonna have that type, which extends either a string or a number. And so at this point, it's now supporting both of these types. It'll carry it through. It'll also make sure that we don't mix like an array of strings here with a value of a number. Like it's not gonna permit that kind of a thing. And so like just to demonstrate that, if I were to give it a string of 1, like it's already going to say, no, that doesn't work, which is great. Something that I kind of found interesting is what if you wanted to explicitly tell the select component that you're using a particular generic? And this is almost like the weirdest syntax, but I just kind of thought it was interesting. So like I can now throw this in my select component, and I can explicitly, instead of using the inference, I can say, I'm going to use a number. Like if one of these was off, it's going to tell me why. It's going to say like, whoa, you're using a string. Like that's not cool. But you don't have to. So like I could switch it back to string and then it's going to force me to kind of switch back. Because all of these are consistent, the array and the default value, I could just remove this. Like that's not necessary. I just thought it was kind of interesting. So that works as well. Cool. Okay. So like one of the very complex bits of front-end development is actually leaving the browser and getting information from a server. And so I want to cover really quick about remote data and how TypeScript can be a really good fit with certain APIs that support strongly typed schemas. So essentially, I'll go ahead and just pull up that example really quick. We have a really basic component here. It's super basic. And so that's kind of the point too. It's like, so we're talking to an API. Things can go wrong. It's hard to sometimes know what you're going to get back. And this is a bit of a best case scenario if you're working with an API that is strongly typed like GraphQL or some Swagger implementations. So you can actually get the schema and make sure that you're safe with what you're writing on the front end and make sure that it matches the expected return type from the API. So I'm going to just dive into that. I already have this, this front-end app hooked up with Apollo. And by the way, I have all of this code hosted on GitHub. I'll throw a link in at the end of the talk. And you're welcome to check it out, see how some of the background stuff is set up. So this is Apollo. We have Apollo client running in the background. I'm going to go ahead and just create a GraphQL file. So I'll call it remote data.graphql.
Okay.
And I'm going to just start writing my query. So this is just remote data. And here's a really cool function or a feature of VS Code. I have a plugin or extension rather, and it's already pinged that server. And I'm, by the way, using the Star Wars GraphQL API. So it's already pinged it, asked for the schema. And so as I type, I keep getting this really cool experience as I'm developing. I can see like the entire API and all of the stuff that I could consume from it. And so I'm going to just start by consuming the films from the Star Wars API. And then I'm just going to dive in, and you could get the total count, some page information, but I'm just going to, it's pretty simple. So I'm going to just go through this. I'm going to pull the ID, and then I'm going to pull the title. And that's probably a good enough starting point. So I have my query, but I don't have like anything here yet. So what I'm going to do is swap over, run yarn generate, which if you want to check out how it's set up, we're using GraphQL generate in the background. And what that has done is, I think, really cool. So in the background, excuse me, in the background, it has actually written a slight bit of code, and that's almost scary, but it's really nothing to be concerned about. Excuse me. So we're going to just pull that in. It throws everything into this generated GraphQL file. And what it does is it takes the name that I named the query with and creates a React hook. So I have use remote data query. So I could actually inspect that and check out what that is. And the really cool thing with TypeScript is it always has like a source. It always has, so it has my types. I can dive in and actually read the code that was happening. It looks like a little less pretty, but like at the end of the day, it's pulled in this use query hook, and it generated types based on the remote schema. It knows what the query will return. It knows what the variables that are required, which in this case, there are no variables, but often there are. And so what it does is it wraps that up onto this like really nice hook for me. So I can just call this. It has a data type. And I'm going to just start rendering it. And so I have it right here. And this is like the easy part. It's almost like ridiculously easy. So I just kind of dig into the item or into the object. And you can see it's doing a lot of stuff for me. It's adding in like the safe operators. It's like I'm almost not having to really think too much about this. I could tell I was on an array. So it's like, it's kind of cool. And let's just test the rendering. Make sure it's actually working. Give it a good old refresh. Oops, obviously missed something there. Somehow I missed that guy. Good, so I can see it's doing something, like clearly. I'm gonna go ahead and get a little further. I'm gonna say, hey, for this film? Well, let's get the title, that's fair. So does that work? Yeah, okay. So now React, if you're familiar with React, you know that you're supposed to give a unique key here, and that's like a perfect use case for an ID. So that's awesome. And at the same time, maybe I'll just add a little spacing here, just make it a bit easier to read. Let's see if that works. Should be fine. I can maybe key value this guy. And so at this point, you can almost see like it would be really easy to iterate with this. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So we have the title, but like how hard would it be to just add another attribute? Like, let's check. So I have other things. I'll do the director, swap over, generate, back. And let's just get that in there. See how easy that is. And let's see, what do we have here? So does it have the director? Yes, it does. That's awesome. So that just created all that code in the background, strongly giving us a stronger guarantee of what is coming back from the server. And so at any point in here, I can see like, hey, this could be undefined, like this could be undefined. Like there's so many things that it's helping me prevent against any runtime errors. And that's, I think, super beneficial. Something weird though, any people familiar with React might spot a weirdness here. Like the film might not have an ID, or like the film might not be defined. That's not good if you have two items or more that have the same key, and that's going to give you an error as well. To guard against that, it's pretty easy. We could just say, well, hey, I have a filter, and if the filter has a film, then let it go through. If it's null, then don't. Like that's pretty basic. Here's the problem. If I do this, TypeScript just doesn't know about it. And so at this point, you have a lot of options. So if you feel like TypeScript is getting in the way, you can just any this and move on because you know that you filtered against that issue. And maybe that's just enough. If I refresh here, it should be fine. But what if you want to let TypeScript work for you? So that you have maybe two more options. You could pull in the type that was automatically generated and just place it in here. However, that's a bit of like a very specific solution. So I want to come up with a maybe more generic solution. And we're going to use generics for that. So, okay, let's say for this filter function, we have some type called T, and it extends a value that we actually don't know because we're making it very generic. And then we're going to say, hey, the film is either that type, or it's null, or it's undefined. We're getting farther, but we haven't told TypeScript what this function actually returns or what it's really built for. What this does is it tells us that, hey, the film is T. And it's not null, it's not undefined. We're almost there. The film needs to be a strict Boolean. TypeScript really wants that. And now you can see here, the film is definitely not null or undefined. So what I could do is kind of fun. I can take advantage of the destructuring because I know I have these items and I can say, yeah, I'm gonna just go ahead and like pull this in, you know, my favorite way of coding, you know, I don't want to have to dot everything. And I think that that's kind of nice. Like this does, in my opinion, just make it a bit more readable. Like I can see like, okay, cool. I've got my stuff here, ID. I think TypeScript is taking a second to really catch up. There we go. And yeah, so this is cool. Let's make sure that this is actually working. Hold on, I'm going to let it refresh. I think sometimes that it just takes a minute, give it a good refresh. Awesome. So there's a lot going on here, but it's pretty cool. Like it just, we could use this everywhere. And so I'll just abstract this. You could say, hey, I'm going to throw this in some file and use this wherever I need. And the cool thing is like, it's just going to take the array of types, remove the undefined or nulls, and give you back the thing you actually wanted. And then you can just go further as you want. So anyways, I think this is super awesome. There's a lot you can do. And I also just think like, you don't have to do everything. You can kind of just progressively use it as you feel like it's actually helping. You don't have to like feel like you're in some kind of a box here. And so with that, I wanted to just cover a few basic, pretty common questions. So I'm just going to tackle these real quick. Does this require me to write more code? I'm going to say, well, it definitely does because it's basically JavaScript plus more stuff. So yeah, you will write more code if you use TypeScript, if you're using, you know, the features from it. But do you have to write a lot more code? Like, I don't think you do. I think that we would heavily bank on inference. So like you could see, I didn't have to strictly type every single variable. Like things just sort of happened in the background. And for me, that's like my preferred way of working with TypeScript. Steep learning curve. So this is another one. Like if you have a team that's very vanilla JS, but they want to try out TypeScript, like you don't have to turn on all of the strict features right away. And you could progressively opt in and just use TypeScript as much as it actually helps you. It doesn't need to slow people down. Third-party library support has really improved in the last 4 years. I would say maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, it was not that great. And you had to do a lot of weird hacks. But I would say if you did try it, like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe try it again and see if it is a better experience. I think a lot of things have improved. And also, if you have a simple app, you just might not need TypeScript. It's fine. Like this is a very much more of a spectrum than you need this or you don't need this. It's just like, what is the best tool for the job? But as your app, if you kind of anticipate your app really growing in complexity, more than just like a Boolean on off, like you may consider just starting with some TypeScript and opting in where it makes sense. So cool. So that is everything I have today. And I just wanted to open up to any questions or any just comments that anyone had.
Hey, Adrian.
Hey.
Really quick question. What about if you have a JavaScript and you're looking to change that into TypeScript? What's kind of the migration or transition should that look like? Or if you already have it in JavaScript, is it not even worth it to try to get it into TypeScript?
Yeah, so I haven't done a lot of those migrations myself. I feel like I may have done one a while ago, but what you could do, what I'd probably recommend is you would go to your TS config and turn off the no implicit any. And so essentially that would allow you to basically do vanilla JavaScript, and you'd have to rename all of your files to TS, or TSX if, using React. And so at that point, I feel like you can get pretty far. You're probably then going to have to deal with your third-party libraries and make sure that you've if they all have types, which at Prismatic, we've imported like a lot of libraries, just a lot. And I think I've only had to type out one explicitly. And I just said, mark this as any and moved on. And the rest already came with their own types. So I would probably start there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else?
Yeah. I'd be real curious to know what you think, how you feel about the difference between vanilla JavaScript and TypeScript when it comes to doing test automation around your code.
Yeah, test automation. We've been using a lot of Puppeteer here, and we started with Cypress. But I'm wondering, what kind of test automation are you thinking? Are you thinking like E2E or more unit testy? Like, where are you focused?
Test automation is kind of my thing, but
Nice.
I tend to focus. Unit testing is great and it should be there, but I tend to focus more on kind of the behavior-driven development and testing kind of larger scenarios, user scenarios, basically, from an automated perspective.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I definitely love automated testing. So at Prismatic we use Puppeteer, and we've had a really good experience with that. And that is actually, we've built our own kind of a mini library around Puppeteer that just does some things for us. So that's all in TypeScript, and I found that hugely beneficial. But as far as interacting with our actual app, perhaps you get some shared code. But I found it to be really nice to work with TypeScript, and just, as far as calling different page functions, or even it brings all of the Puppeteer automation, it brings all of their function arguments and functions into the editor as I'm writing it. So I feel like that's been super nice. Is that what you were curious about?
Yeah.
Cool.
Would you say that you're more productive using TypeScript over something like just vanilla JS?
Yeah, I would. I've actually, I've been switching between two different things. And so I'd be on TypeScript for one, and then the other one, go to vanilla, and I'm like, well, how does it not know? I command click through and I'm like, well, how does this not know what file I'm importing from? Or I'm importing this thing, how does it not know? And it had a lot of, VS Code really struggled to get far as TypeScript would when it's, figuring out how things are connected up. TypeScript basically looks all the way down the chain and figures out where everything's connected. So completely on my day-to-day, I feel much more productive using TypeScript. And I'm to the point where I would feel maybe more comfortable if I'm starting even a side project, probably just do it in TypeScript, because then if I feel like using some more specific types, I can, and it keeps things going. And I think on top of that, as a team, it just exponentially makes it a lot easier because you don't have to know everything all at one time, all in your head. That's what makes it nice.
Hey, Adrian, it's Justin. Can definitely confirm that. When I jump into the front end of our application, which is of substantial size now, I lean on those types pretty hard, I gotta say. So that's been great. My question is, you're obviously a huge proponent of TypeScript. I guess what are some things about the language that you think maybe they got wrong, or what are some things you don't like about it, I guess, as well?
I would say probably at first I was probably one of those folks that was well, if it's a superset, it should just let me paste my JavaScript in here. So it's a little confusing at first, because JavaScript, you can just paste whatever you want into a browser and it just runs. And so that's kind of cool. So, and then TypeScript has like this whole tsconfig, and like you have to know like more stuff. So when I first started, I was pretty disappointed with, I guess, the ecosystem and like the whole setup process and how often like things just didn't work. I feel like that's a lot different these days. So I feel like things have come pretty far. I'm trying to think of like anything that I don't like about it. So it's one of those things that's like, after you know how it works, you already know how to solve the problem. But I think that like at first things can be a slight bit confusing. Like, well, I'm just going to use any. And I think like, I would just recommend not to feel bad about using any if you're just getting started. Like that's just not a bad thing to do. So I think there's some purists out there that would just not like that, but I think it's fine. I'm struggling to like actually point out something I dislike, but I'd love to hear anyone else's, thoughts on that.
Oh, that's awesome. The complexity of the tooling definitely resonates with me particularly hard, as you're well aware.
Yeah. I guess like maybe importing in a mono repo from one thing to the next and like, oh, I have to compile it. I think probably having a compile step, if you're not already doing that, is going to be like, if you're not already using like Babel or something, and like this is your first time using compiling, it can feel kind of frustrating. Yeah, the tooling, like if something doesn't quite work out right, it can be horrible at times.
So,
sorry, Aaron. I was going to jump in.
Ahead.
That was cool. Galatia here, Adrian. And I don't know if this is something that you can demonstrate off the cuff, but as we've worked with React and TypeScript, I'm just really curious about how other people are structuring their code as far as like the architecture of where things sit and how close they are side by side, especially in an app that kind of grows beyond just the small demo examples that are out there. And so I didn't know if you wanted to say your 2 cents or philosophy on how you personally decide to do that where you're at.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a good question. Like I'm always thinking about that. I'm kind of honestly always reevaluating that and trying to say like, is this really working for us? At Prismatic, we use a mono repo. And so that's like a big starting point of like that question is like, so with a mono repo, do I throw this into as another package? So I would probably, if I were starting over, say like, hey, I might do all of my very UI stuff. And so like going back to that example where we had this like function wrapping, I feel like something like this extension, I would love for all of that to just sit as one package. And it's basically like you have material UI, and then you have like our stuff, our Prismatic stuff, or like what have you on your project sitting in its own package that could be consumed by any front end. And like often at companies, you have like several front ends that need to consume, and they want all their buttons to look the same. So like, I would just say that moving stuff out of the project is like, I would love that. So we currently have a setup where we have components, we have features, and then we kind of drill in through that. And then I think it's going to depend on your state library. We heavily bank on Apollo and context, but like often people are using Redux. And so people have opinions on how that should be set up. Often a lot of my patterns will be like, I'll start with something simple. And then as I build on it, I might say like, okay, I have this example, but now I'll move it down a level into a directory and I'll nest things as needed. I guess it's a hard question because it just depends on how complex the project is. But right now, I think we have components, we have features, and I think we have a hooks directory. So it's kind of like a bit split out that way. But obviously, if you go too far in that on that road, like you lose some of the benefits of like a domain-driven design or domain kind of organized. So it's a
that
challenge.
Was kind of what I've been facing too. Kind of where we're at is that battle, that balance, right? And so
it's hard, yeah. And I guess like some people online they'll say like, hey, yeah, just use it until it doesn't make sense and then fix it and then go from there. But I mean it's a challenge for sure.
Glad to hear I'm not alone. That's all I needed.
So going back a little bit to talking about features of the language you don't like, a common criticism, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but a common criticism I've heard leveled at TypeScript is that if you come to it without knowing JavaScript first, it can become a crutch that prevents you from really understanding how JavaScript works under the hood. And then that can lead to trouble debugging things when it doesn't work the way you want, you know? And I know you said at the beginning, you came from JavaScript first, so I don't know how much you can speak to that. I'm just curious if it's kind of a danger zone that you've seen or anything like that.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. I think like there could be, like, I think there's definitely room to say like, yeah, that could happen. Somebody was like, they've only ever developed in TypeScript, and then they go to paste something in their browser, like, well, why doesn't it work? Like, that's confusing perhaps. So the other side of the coin, like for me, coming from JavaScript, like I knew some basics, of course, but like I felt like TypeScript actually ended up teaching me things, because I would just like go over in here and be like, well, what is this? Like, what is this div? Oh, pardon me, I've got the pinwheel. I would kind of dive in, check out like these types, like what is an HTML div element? And like, I don't know, this is not like the perfect example, but like you can even just see like it's bringing in all these docs. So I'm like on, and then on can play on all of these things. But you could probably make the same argument against TypeScript that you can make against React. Like, so someone says on change, in React land, that's cased differently than vanilla land. And so like they become crutched on React, they become crutched on TypeScript. So I kind of feel like that is just going to happen with whatever tooling you're using. Like, but yeah, I think it's important to like maybe guard against it and just do some pure JS stuff just so you know how it's working. But then like with TypeScript, it's helped me understand more of the type side of things. And I felt like kind of brought that to my attention where I would have kind of glossed over it in the past.
Sure, excellent.
Do you feel that the debugging process and troubleshooting process is more complex in this environment or easier? Or what are some pros and cons of going this direction, I suppose, and that side of it?
Yeah, there are totally pros and cons. At first, when I was using TypeScript, I think when Angular 2 came out, I was trying that out and just thinking how ridiculous it was that like I'm getting this browser error that's pointing to like something that's not pointing to the line number of my TypeScript file, and being so frustrated with that. Like that's like a pretty bad experience, and like having to really weirdly piece things together. With how everything is set up with Create React App with their TypeScript implementation, like it does point you to the place in your TypeScript file. So that's good. So like I would say early on, like debugging was much harder. Now I feel like it's quite nice. And you also get like the IntelliSense as you're running through. So I feel like that's a plus. Although you could get, you can make the argument like JS and VS Code, like you actually get a good amount of IntelliSense for like third-party stuff. But so personally for me, like I feel day to day, like it's very much helping me with debugging. And you could also run into situations where your types don't actually match what the real world does. And so you have to like realize that's happening. If you're using perhaps like an outdated type library, or you've done it wrong and it like done some kind of a weird escaping of any and then asserted that it was something. So like you can get into weird situations. So if you're aware of that, it's not too bad. I still think it's a hard question. Like I think I found it to be fine, but maybe other people have gotten into corners of TypeScript where it's not working for them. There also is the other layer, the compiling step. If you're not used to a compiling step, like that is just probably really frustrating. Like you're used to just running your code, not transforming it before running it. So that's a whole nother complexity layer.
Fair enough.
Adrian, I'm trying to remember, does the Create React App sort of setup now kind of give you a lot of that stuff like at the beginning so you don't have to work so hard? I feel like that's what I recognized.
Yeah, it does. It's super nice. I just pulled this in last weekend and like, it's just doing all of the stuff for me. I'm just running it here like, oh yeah, it's letting me know I did something. I signed A somewhere. That's fine. But yeah, it's all like, it generates all your TypeScript errors will like show up in the terminal, and it sets up all the TypeScript. You just create a React app, you run the create React app command with like a TypeScript flag, and it just does everything for you. Like, it's pretty easy. So yeah, I think it's pretty nice. I'm curious if anyone else out there has like experiences with TypeScript, like good or bad, that they'd be interested in sharing.
Yeah, I guess this is Kevin.
Isaac.
Isaac and I are sitting in the room. So, hi, Galatia. I recognize your voice from.
Hey, yeah, I recognize a few. Yeah. Hey, Kevin.
Cool. So, we're sitting at Omnitech here, but I worked at a different client, and we were there for quite a long time. I was on the UI team. We actually made the transition from JavaScript to TypeScript. That would have been 5-6 years ago. We started doing that when it was, version 1, version 2. And it was a big change, changing files from TS to JS to TS, and then getting, I think we used Grunt at that time. That was the cool tool.
Yeah.
And then we could move forward incrementally and say, okay, next time you work on that page, let's make it TypeScript. And yeah, Any was a great tool for that too, to move forward. But after a year or two of doing that, like Adrian said, it's so much nicer. I've kind of become the, hey, you should use TypeScript on that thing type guy. So
Nice.
That's awesome.
Advocate for it. I was going to say that the developers that I've been working with come from really strict languages, and I feel like TypeScript kind of helps comfort them as they step into web, because they don't have to be so afraid of types not matching up and things like that. So TypeScript has kind of been that middleman between somebody who maybe doesn't have experience working with JavaScript, working with something like C# coming in and feeling a little more like comfort there.
Yeah, completely. That's awesome. That's a really good way of looking at it.
Yeah, I was just about to make that comment, that it seems like it's Microsoft's way of C-sharping JavaScript a little bit.
Yeah, they knew they wouldn't win changing what actually runs in the browser, but we'll do the rest. That's awesome.
And you got to remember that when they started that, JavaScript really was half as good as it is now, because I don't think JavaScript had classes yet. So trying to do inheritance with vanilla JavaScript is not very fun either.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it really felt like JavaScript kind of drove a lot of those ES6 changes, like classes and stuff like that. Or like that, TypeScript drove a lot of those next generation JavaScript features.
Yeah, completely. I love the new syntax that we're getting, each year, whatnot, for JavaScript, and I do think it's good. We're getting, better language support, better tooling. Like, it's very exciting. It's pretty fun to see how things are evolving there.
Based on your use of TypeScript, is that something that's taking off pretty well? Is there a lot of documentation? I'm used to Python, where you can search a Python thing and you're going to get 300 different results for it because it is so popular right now. Are you seeing the same thing with TypeScript, where if you run into a problem, there's going to be a lot of other people who have experienced something similar?
Yeah, 100%. I think that TypeScript has really, really taken off. There's a ton of Stack Overflow stuff on it. And I think that even Stack Overflow does like a survey each year, and they're showing that like TypeScript has really increased in popularity. And there's a ton of answers on there. I can definitely, attest to that. I'm often getting answers from Stack Overflow. So also just a lot of blog posts, Medium, various blogs that are just explaining in a very, very consumable way how TypeScript can work in certain cases. So I feel like every question I have about TypeScript is already answered on Google somewhere.
So you'd probably recommend then going in the direction of using TypeScript over trying to use the native language, even though the syntax and features are getting more and more, I don't want to say comparable because it's probably too strong a word, but obviously they're heading in that direction, right? Slowly but surely.
Sure. I think it's actually, it's definitely a plus. Like, you don't want to get yourself into like a weird corner where you can't use JavaScript because that is literally the language that runs in the browser. But like letting TypeScript assist you and kind of be like some guardrails as you're going through things and that sort of a thing, like that is, in my opinion, really helpful. So I think just being flexible and being able to do either is probably important overall. But I mean, personally, I just really feel productive with it. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, well, and I think when you have, like particularly working with React, you're probably already using things like JSX. And so you've already got a compile cycle going and a local CI, stuff like that. So you're not really paying a lot of extra overhead for running TypeScript versus straight JavaScript.
Yeah, definitely. And they've actually their recent versions of TypeScript have improved their compiling time significantly. So yeah, I don't notice a huge overhead difference. Probably like the biggest overhead, I'll be honest, is maybe local resources in VS Code, like propagating. So like in JavaScript, like things will go a little faster. And right now I have like a few different things running in the background, but like it typically, like, yeah, you do pay for the resources that you're using. I might see a slight delay if I'm in a big project, something like that.
Any final questions before we sign off for the day?
Yeah, I have a really quick speculative question just about, what kind of legs React has into the future, or really just the web stack in general. And this is, feel free to chime in if anyone else has an opinion. I'm just curious as to, talking about comparisons between just TypeScript 5 years ago and now. Like it's really come to mature, as has React. I think 2 years ago when hooks came out, like it was such a fundamental change that it made the developer experience so much better. But with the advent of stuff like Flutter and WebAssembly, which mind you has been on the radar for like the last 4 years, hasn't really made too much progress. But with stuff like that, is it worth swapping over for people who maybe are pretty invested into a stack that isn't React and they're doing okay? Is there stuff coming up on the radar that maybe, I don't know, will usurp React or pose some threat to the point of where investing time now might be time wasted? That was kind of a classic question, but just what are general thoughts?
Yeah, that's of course a hard one, but like, okay. I think that for a while, like, because just the whole upgrade cycle, like this JavaScript is going to continue to dominate for a while, like in the near future. In the farther future, it's just completely too difficult to say. I'm curious, are you already writing JavaScript-based code for like front end, or are you just kind of hoping that maybe you'll be able to write front ends using something like Python in the future?
No, I'm using a JavaScript stack. I was just curious as to, no, I'm using a JavaScript type stack.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And actually, I think that there's a lot of other great frameworks besides JavaScript. Besides React. And so like a lot of people get really hung up on like React versus Vue versus all the others. And like, so I think that they're all pretty valid. They almost are like almost doing all the same thing these days. Like they're catching up to each other. Probably if I were starting brand new in a project, just looking at the team, I would say, hey, probably React is a high consideration because there's so much ecosystem. Like there's such a big ecosystem there that you don't have to write code for a ton of things because other people already did it. So I see just a huge benefit there. So like, would I try to like one day switch, if we were on Vue and already had an app out, I wouldn't try to switch us to React. I just say like, you kind of have to just ask, maybe is your team familiar with one technology, then just keep going with that. The actual stuff that happens is getting pretty similar.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, we started doing more work in React pretty recently, and I think that like there's always other frameworks that I know. Svelte is another one that's coming up that's kind of like lighter React with maybe doing some abuse of the new ES6 features to try to kind of minimize the size of the library. But the concepts in it, I think, are what's the most helpful for organizing a big, like a front end heavy project or like a one-page app type of approach, where you do have that componentization of like, I've got everything in one file, or at least a small set of related files, and I can kind of know how the state and properties are managed. Whereas doing things old school with straight JavaScript or even jQuery, it's like it's a little less organized and things are kind of pushing around in whatever structure you want. So just having those organizing principles in there and kind of having this slightly opinionated framework about it has been really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember one of my earlier apps writing in jQuery and JavaScript, and it was just a mess of like mutating the DOM directly, and just it gets crazy fast if you want to grow something. So completely. Justin, did you have any other things you wanted to say?
No, not really. Just great job, Adrian. Thank you for giving the talk. I found it to be, I learned some things today. It was pretty interesting. Hope everybody else did as well. So I'll just say, and thanks to everybody else for joining on, today over the lunch hour. So with that, everybody take care and see you next time.
Awesome. See you guys later. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.